Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry. Tonight we are going to be finishing off our month on assessment by getting more in depth and talking about how we assess student writing in our classroom. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty and I am a junior grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada. And I come live every single Monday night to talk about using inquiry-based practices in all aspects of your classroom with the hopes of making using inquiry-based learning in your classroom more fun and accessible for both you and your students. So thank you so much for joining me. So we're going to dig right in and talk about writing assessment. Lately, this has been one of the topics that I am asked a lot is, okay, if I'm using writing in my classroom, how exactly am I assessing it? Especially if I'm allowing students to have more voice and choice in my classroom, if I'm differentiating my writing tasks, how exactly am I assessing if all of my students are not writing the same thing at the same time? So we're going to dig in and I'm going to share with you kind of the things that I'm working on for writing. So we can dig right in. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the background and kind of what writing looks like specifically in my classroom. If you have not seen me talk before about my literacy program, I'm going to give you a quick overview background of what writing looks like specifically in my room. We're going to talk about the stages of the writing process as well as how we assess writing in both the formative stage as well as summative tasks. So we're going to look at all of those together. So a little bit of background. I am using my Ignited Literacy program in my classroom. Now this is a cyclical approach to comprehensive literacy, which means that my students are developing a lot of student voice and choice, and they are choosing every week or so or every month what it is that they're writing about in my classroom. It also means that writing is going to take much more time than perhaps more traditional 6-week rounds of units, because students are going to slowly develop the writing skills over a much longer period of time. But what I have found is they actually develop a much stronger sense of who they are as a writer, as well as deepen their actual skills as a writer as well. Now, it also means that because my students are doing what they're interested in writing about and not simply just completing a task that I have assigned, I've picked it, I've assigned it, I told them what to write, and they just write based on what I want, it makes writing more risky. So this is often going to be a bit of a hurdle at the beginning of using more of an inquiry spiraling approach in writing, because as students need to learn how to trust you with their writing as well as trust themselves that their words and their voice matters when it comes to writing. So there's a bit of a hurdle sometimes at the beginning as students are beginning to explore themselves as writers. So this is a quote that I found in the Guides to Effective Instruction, and I thought it was really appropriate for our conversation tonight. So a successful writing program requires knowledgeable, organized teacher with excellent classroom management skills. Mostly students need lots of time in which to write, a say in what they write about, strategies that allow them to problem solve independently, such as planning, revising, editing, and a helpful response. So this is a good way for me. It kind of encapsulates what I feel as though my writing program needs to look like. There certainly is going to be a lot of independent time for students to be writing, but because I have realistic expectations for what independent work looks like in my classroom, and that it's not 100% silent all the time, but that there is going to be a bit of talking, students are going to be generally focused on what it is they're writing about, then I am able to get my students to work independently. And I'll be completely honest, when students are given more voice and choice in their classroom and the task is at their independent level, then it is much easier to keep them on task and focused during independent work times. So let's look a little bit more at the stages of the writing process. So these are looking at what exactly are my expectations for writing, what I want them to go through, as well as looking at some of those transitions that students are going to be making as they're getting into writing. So for example, the transitions, as what I'm expecting for myself as a teacher, is students who are new to junior or perhaps even in grade 3, the transition that they are going to move from simply writing sentences with picture supports into getting them to write non-picture supported pieces of fiction, or even conducting research that allows them to write a report that's based on that new information they've gathered, is quite a task that students travel through in the junior grades. So there are definitely going to be some growing pains. I typically know that within the first 3 months, grade 4 students who have always had experiences where they're simply just writing what they're told to write, they tend to have the largest amount of difficulty in transitioning to developing their own set as a writer. A lot of the times, these are students that have never thought of themselves as a writer before. They're a doer, but they're not a writer. They may struggle sometimes with creative thinking and they just want to be able to do. Or the opposite is true. They have so many creative ideas, they have a very hard time kind of structuring that into a simple narrative plot. Sometimes these could be your really active readers that have wild imaginations and they want to put every single detail they have into one story instead of learning how to edit out some of the less important details. So some of these growing pains that students are going to have are totally normal and expected. And we have to give students the time and guidance to kind of go through that storm before we get to some type of clarity. And again, I typically expect that to be about the first 3 months, and then I start seeing some gains. Once a student has gone through this type of learning about themselves as a writer, and they've gone through this stormy period of writing, then they often get to a more calm period where there is exponential growth in terms of their writing because something's finally sunk in and it's clicked because they've tried it a couple of different ways, and those students will click. Not all students, some students do take much longer, but for the majority of students, they kind of find their voice and find themselves and learn how to get a bit more focused after about that 3 or 4 month period. So it means that we need to, if we're using this kind of approach in our classroom where we're allowing students to write what they're wanting to write, we need to give them the time and space to do so. That means that you're not expecting mastery of any one skill in a very quick succession. You're looking for very small gains over a short period of over a longer period of time. So if they write for you and then you'll give them 1 or 2 goals to work on next, then they're making small gains over a longer period of time instead of quick gains in one specific area of writing. They're going to make smaller gains over a much wider form of writing. You also need to let go as a teacher, correcting every single error that a student will make. Because you're going to be just focusing on 1 or 2 of the most important things that a student needs to fix right now before they can move on, kind of like a triage of writing. You're going to triage their writing, not focus on everything and fix everything, or maybe just worry yourself that they kind of are horrible at everything, especially during that stormy period that they might be having. Focus on 1 or 2 triage pieces that you can do and be okay if not everything is perfect. Remember that they are beginning to learn to write for themselves, and they're not necessarily always just simply writing because you've asked them to. So, formative assessment. Now, formative assessment is where we are giving our students the time to get it right. So we want to give them plenty of opportunities to write and experiment with developing their voice and their ideas in writing. And we want to be able to give them the time that it's going to take them to develop that as a writer. So when we're looking at formative assessment, I like to look at it as a cyclical process that we're going through with our students. And if we narrow that down, there's really 4 different categories. And it's the plan, the time when students are doing it, the time when we are checking in with them, and then they're acting on what we gave them, acting on that feedback and setting new goals. Now, often when you look at the cycle of assessment, it often is referring to what the teacher is doing. So this is more about what the teacher and student, primarily student, is doing as we are joining them and assessing them throughout this process. So in the planning phase, you will have your students, you're going to give them the expectations, and this is going to probably happen in a whole group or in small group, and you're going to have them set goals as to what they think they need to work on next. And you're really focusing on one or two most important goals for the students to focus on. And you want to give them clear expectations on what it is that you expect good writing to look like, or good writing to feel like, or what elements. And this, again, you'll add more expectations as you are going through the year. So simply at this point, it might simply be that I write a story that makes sense, or I use an organizer before writing. And it can be as simple as that, but you're going to set the goal, and then you're going to give your students an idea of what success looks like, and then they're going to do it. And then they're going to begin to write. And this is where students are going to give it a try, and they're going to try to write by meeting those expectations. And through this time, this is a great place for the teacher to check in and monitor the student throughout the process. And this is a great place for you to be observing what students are doing, how they're working through their writing. Check in with a few of your students that you think might need more support than simply conferencing with you when they're done a piece of writing. And really check in with them and use those observational pieces for the triangulation of data to use that to assess your students. Then they're going to check in with you, and this is where you're going to have a student-teacher conference, and this is a great place for you to be assessing students through your conversations with them, as well as giving them feedback as to what they're going to do next, and that is the descriptive feedback that we're going to be providing to our students. Now, it means too that you're not going to give them feedback on absolutely everything they need to improve. Again, you're going to triage what are the most important skills that a student will need to focus on in that moment for when they're going to be writing next. So I always will have that compliment sandwich of here's what you did well, here's what you need to work on. This is something I want to see you kind of moving forward because I think it's a skill of yours. And then what are you writing next? And how are you going to show this improvement? And then finally, students are they're going to take action, and they are going to be able to respond to that feedback, integrate that piece of information as they move forward to write again. And they're also going to set new writing goals, because the hope is that once they've conferenced with you, the next time you see them, there's going to be improvement on that area that you talked about. And that's always the goal there. So some of my tips and tricks are I would recommend to read their writing prior to actually conferencing with them, so then you're not spending all of the time during a conference reading their work while they're sitting there. I like to, if I can remember to always do it, is to read their pieces of writing prior to when their conference is. It also allows me to discover some of their strengths as a writer, as well as highlight some of the needs that they have. I firmly believe that every single student has something to say and has a strength as a writer, so you can always find something that they did well. Even if their story is completely illogical, very rarely makes sense, and is riddled with spelling and grammar errors, they might have really creative ideas. It's also a great time to have some accountable talk with your students where you can chat about what it is that they did well, how they're feeling about writing. I find sometimes that's a big indicator about success as a writer, is their personal feelings of who they are as a writer and whether or not they're very good at it. I find also that those students that come into my classroom not feeling like they're a very confident writer, through feedback begin to understand both their strengths and their needs at a much more complex level, and begin to feel far more positive about their skills set as a writer. Student-teacher conferences also allow for a high level of accountability. It's really easy for a student to ignore written feedback. And I find if I'm sitting down with a student and I can question them about some of the difficulties they might be having, or what perhaps got in their way of success, that this often provides a very strong tool for accountability, holding your students accountable for what it is they were willing to do, what they put out there, and maybe pushing them to take more risks as a writer. So again, reading ahead of time. I always provide my students in a compliment sandwich. So I will always focus on a strength first and tell them what I really liked about their writing. Then I will focus on those 1 or 2 needs that I think we need to move on specifically to move forward as a writer. And then I will end it by telling them a growth or area of growth, or giving them a little anecdote that I think would be helpful, and maybe even making a connection to something that they reminded me of, or something that I really liked about their story. I might pick a character I really liked, or maybe a line that they wrote that I really enjoyed. I'll kind of tell them what I enjoyed about their story. So again, that's kind of what their skills were well as a writer versus what their needs are, and then perhaps my personal little anecdote about something that I liked specifically about their story. And again, I'm focusing on those 1 or 2 skills. I cannot focus on everything. These are students that are learning how to write, and they're learning how to find their voice in writing. So there's always going to be a ton of things that they could improve upon. But I'm not looking at fixing absolutely everything all the time. And I always want them leaving me with a goal and a next step, so that they know what I expect to see the next time they meet in conference with me. And at the very end of all of that conferencing time with my students, it is essential that I make notes and record those observations, as well as the conversations I had, and some assessment of the product that they handed me. I am still recording during this time, although it's not a summative piece, and I'm definitely expecting growth. I do record where a student, if I had to give them an evaluation on that piece of writing, exactly where they are now. If it was report card time and that was the test, what mark would I give them? And all I do, the only reason I do that is I'm not necessarily using these as pieces for my report card mark, but what I do want to see is I want to see growth over time, so that when I'm finally at the end and doing summative assessment at the end of the term, I am definitely seeing that a student has made growth in the areas that we needed them to. So again, I found this is another quote that I found from the Guide to Effective Instruction. It is unrealistic to expect children to locate and correct every mechanical error in their compositions. Not even published books are error-free. Despite everyone's best effort to hire the absolute best editors, it doesn't always happen that everyone is error-free. You can definitely thank you to everybody who has ever emailed me letting me know that they found an error. I very much appreciate that. So when I'm giving feedback, I often categorize those triage. So I said I'm triaging 1 or 2 things. And I generally in my head have a list of things in an order of what's going to be the most pressing that I need to address first as their skills in a writer, so that if I'm seeing these things, this is how I prioritize what I'm going to point out as their next steps first. So for the purposes of this video, I actually wrote it out as to what it is that I prioritize first to 10th of the things that I'm going to comment on. And if it's generating ideas, that is the first thing that I'm going to be commenting on. If the student had a difficult time coming up with an idea about what they want to write about, that's what I have to deal with first. Before I can deal with anything else, I need to deal with that fact first. So the first thing I'm focusing on is generating ideas. Then it's planning, organization, and research. I need to make sure that they actually have stuff in which they're going to write about. Once they have stuff, then I'm focusing on plot, because sometimes students just need to put out all of their ideas on paper, and once they get their ideas, then they can organize them into a cohesive plot if they're writing a fiction story. Or I'm looking at the structure and form in terms of whether or not they're meeting the structure and form of the writing form that they chose, whether they're using the different techniques. So are they using subheadings? Are they using dialogue properly, quotations? This is where I'm looking at structures, where I might be looking at really egregious spelling and grammar errors that are interfering with my ability to comprehend their writing. I mean, I will skip straight to structure if I can't even read a word on the page, or there's absolutely no punctuation, then I'm definitely jumping to that. As long as the comprehensibility is there for their writing, I do leave some of that structural grammar and spelling components a little bit later. So I will bump it to the top if it's incomprehensible, but if I understand kind of what's happening, I will bump it back down to say spot number 6. And again, these are in a permanent order. This is just kind of how I have structured it myself. Finally, if students can understand plot and structure, then I'm working on descriptions and details and adding. If they don't have a plot, I don't need to focus on their use of adjectives and adverbs and making interesting sentences. Yes, that's a really important thing to do, but there's other more important things like actually having a plot in your story before I can actually ask you to add details and descriptions. Then I'm looking at really developing things like a student voice and making them show up in their writing, as well as looking at advanced plot and character development, and then using things like literary techniques by adding similes and metaphors and foreshadowing and all of those things that could be added into more advanced things that I could ask students to do. So again, more quotes from the Guides to Effective, and these are pulled specifically out of this guide to effective instruction about feedback. So feedback during conferencing can equip them with the information and strategies that lead to revisions and improvements to the written process. And during the sustained writing time, students write and respond to reading while the teacher provides precise writing instruction and feedback to individuals and small groups, which is exactly what I think is why it's so important that we are teaching our students to work independently, because this is right there in the guide as to how we should be teaching literacy instruction. Now, assessment doesn't always have to be different. Instead of focusing on the writing process, I will instead focus on the writing form, because I'm differentiating and I have students at a wide range of abilities in my classrooms. Then I want to make sure that I'm focusing on students looking at the different levels of the writing process, regardless of what writing form they are using. It also means that I'm going to focus on the TAC levels of the achievement chart, and this is where I'm starting to get into more summative assessment of my students, where I'm actually going to begin to evaluate how they are based on their grade level and the set of expectations. So instead of focusing on can they write a humorous story, which is I'm sure very relevant, I'm much more concerned with less about whether they can write a humorous story or whether they can write a legend or a fairy tale. And I'm far more concerned with, can they actually write a story with a plot? Can they generate ideas? Can they do some research when they're writing a report? Can they organize their ideas? Can they draft, revise, and edit what they have written? I think that's far more essential pieces that will carry them through as writers than specifically teaching them how to write, or getting them specifically to write forms of my own choosing, especially if it's not relevant to who they are. So I will use rubrics at this point that focus on the skills of a writer, allows for differentiation. It gives more time for the students to develop their skills. It's small and incremental growth over time. And I use rubrics for both formative and summative assessment. So I will often not share these rubrics with students while marking them through the formative pieces. And I will use these rubrics for my own self, so that I find that it's far more useful to give students feedback instead of marks at that point, or even on a continuum where they happen to be. But it won't be until the later on, when I'm getting closer to evaluation of student writing, that I'm starting to actually break out the rubrics and co-creating them with my students. And I have other ones for nonfiction as well. So when I'm coming up with summative tasks and I'm using these things to get them to write or mark for my report card, I am using checklists and rubrics to make sure that students are meeting the criteria that I'm looking for. I will often use a portfolio where I will ask students to go back into all of the things they've written me for that term, select one or two pieces of writing that are the best examples of their skills as a writer, asking them to do some self-reflection on what they've learned through the term and how they have improved. So even if this was my first draft on this story and then I went and improved it and I made improvements and now look at it now, I will have students go through the whole writing process with that selected piece of writing and have them edit and revise it and make a polished good copy and look at the differences between those two pieces. I will often do what is a quick write at the end of the term to kind of just assess what what they're able to write in a short amount of time and how much they have actually integrated the conversations that we have been having about writing, as well as using rubrics for assessment of their learning. So that is all we have for today. I'm hoping that you have learned a little bit more about writing and assessment and what that's going to look like through the entire process of both the formative and summative pieces of your writing assessment. And if you would like more information about the comprehensive literacy, including the rubrics and getting a comprehensive literacy program going in your classroom that lasts all year long, you can find out more through my program Ignited Literacy at www.ignitedliteracy.com. And if you've missed an episode of Teaching with Inquiry and you would like to catch up on what you've missed, you can go to www.teachingwithinquiry.com to find links to the rebroadcast podcast versions of these shows, which you can find on Apple iTunes, as well as these videos are rebroadcast on YouTube as well. And they're also transcribed into a blog post for you if you prefer to read it. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week again on Monday as we continue to talk about all things inquiry in your classroom. Thanks so much. Talk to you later. Bye for now.